friends, welcome to Spooks and Roots. My name is Joanna and I go by ATX Plant Mom on Instagram, and welcome to my channel. This is a series in which I talk about true crime, urban legends, and spooky things in general while I take care of my plants. Tending to my plants gives me something to do, plus I have so many plants I always need to tend to anyways as I'm talking about true crime. So in terms of plants today, while we're talking about the case, I will be potting and cleaning up the leaves of my Syngonium chia pens right here, which I've been propagating for a couple of weeks now. And I will be cleaning the leaves of several other Syngonium varietals I have here on the table, such as my Syngonium white butterfly, my Syngonium albo, and my Syngonium confetti. And so I like to clean the leaves of my plants with a mixture of neem oil and some drops of dish soap diluted in water, just to help with the photosynthesis of the leaves as well as pest prevention. So it's just overall a good thing to do for your plants. So just a bit of background, this is something that I've always wanted to do. I've always loved true crime, and ever since I was a kid, I loved watching Law & Order after school. I also like talking about urban legends, ghost stories, and just generally morbid and scary things. So I thought, why not talk about it while I'm taking care of my plants? So this is an idea that I've been thinking about since the end of 2019, early 2020, and well, we all know what happened with 2020, and so I've been noodling on this for a while, and I decided to get things going again with Crimetober. And so it's really cool to have this platform to talk about true crime while combining this passion with other things I'm passionate about, like plants. So I just want to say a shout out to Bailey Sarian, who does makeup and true crime, and Harley G, who has a series with plants and true crime. I just want to say thank you to both of you for giving me the confidence to give something like this a try. So this is my first episode, and let's see how it goes. So I just want to say a disclaimer that everything I say is based off of the research of what I found online, and I do not mean any disrespect at all to any of the persons mentioned in this video. So the case we have today is the 1991 Austin Yogurt Shop murders. This case is disturbing, it's incredibly dark, and almost 30 years later, it still remains unsolved. DNA profiling has been done, and yet we still don't know who did this. Over 50 false confessions have been made on this case, and over 340 suspects were looked into. The case blew up in the media at the time and became one of the most high-profile cases in Texas history. So this case takes place in the early 90s on Friday, December 6, 1991, in Austin, Texas. The Austin we know now was very different back then. The population of Austin, Texas, then in the early 90s was around 475,000, and that is a stark contrast with today's population, which is just a little over 1 million. As a resident of Austin, it's difficult to imagine how different Austin was back then. Back then, Austin was a lot smaller, even for a college town. It gave off more of like small town feels and far less than the popular city it is now today. Violent crime was not common, and parents trusted their children to go out and hang out even at night without any supervision. Again, it was the early 90s. So overall, again, there was just this sense of safety that was felt from people who grew up in Austin at the time. The early 90s was the time when malls were big. There was always things to do, places to hang out. Just mall culture was huge, which is very different than how it is today. The early 90s was also the time when satanic panic was on the rise around the country. So there were two 17-year-old girls, Eliza Thomas and Jennifer Harbison. They were working late at the night shift at the yogurt shop called I Can't Believe It's Yogurt in the Hillside Strip Center near the North Cross Mall in North Austin. The North Cross Mall was a popular place to hang out if you were a teenager. There were many businesses there to go to, such as candy shops, an arcade, a food court, even an ice skating rink. And so it was a generally pretty busy area, especially on the weekends. Jennifer Harbison's younger sister, 15-year-old Sarah, was hanging out with her close friend Amy Ayers, who was 13. Sarah and Amy were planning to meet at the yogurt shop to help Eliza and Jennifer close for the night, and then they were planning to have a sleepover. The girls met through FFA, which stands for Future Farmers of America, and they spent a lot of time together in FFA events and bonded over their mutual love for farm animals. Jennifer and Sarah were very close sisters. Jennifer was a senior in high school, and she was president of the FFA's chapter at their school. Jennifer was very outgoing, she was very active in school, and she loved spending time with her friends and her boyfriend and was part of the varsity track team. Sarah was very active in school extracurriculars. She was a cheerleader. She also played in sports such as volleyball and basketball. Eliza was a senior in high school, and she loved poetry, writing, and dancing, and she dreamed of one day becoming a veterinarian. Amy and Sarah were really close, and similar to Eliza, Amy dreamed of one day becoming a veterinarian. So it was around 9:30, 10 in the evening, and a man named Daryl Croft came into the yogurt shop. It was already pretty late, with most shops in the shopping center closing around 7 p.m. And the yogurt shop was known to be one of the last shops to close at 11. I think even today, a shop closing at 11 is pretty late. The shop next door to the yogurt shop was a party store, which was closed to any customers by 7 p.m. But the owner, Jorge Barney, had a lot of work to do that night. So Jorge Barney stayed late, and he worked in his back office, which shared the wall with the back of the yogurt shop. He put on an episode of Cheers, ate pizza while he worked. He later reports not hearing anything, but he was the first one to smell smoke. Back at the yogurt shop, as Daryl entered the business, Jennifer was serving customers their yogurt and Eliza was working the register. Eliza's mother, Maria, had stopped by the shop to check in on the girls, which was a regular thing for her to do. So Eliza was chatting with her mother when Daryl came into the yogurt shop. In the meantime, Sarah Harbison and Amy Ayers were sitting in a booth nearby in the yogurt shop, eating pizza. They had brought pizza over from Mr. Gaddy's a few stores down. They eventually went to the back of the shop to clean dishes in order to help out Jennifer and Eliza as part of the closing protocol. So Daryl was a former military policeman. He owned a security company at the time, and he drove a car with lights on the top of the roof. So it looked similar to that of a cop car. As Daryl pulled up in his car, a young man inside the yogurt shop noticed him in his car, and he became noticeably agitated. This man stood out, for he was acting really antsy, and he kept insisting, telling customers that were behind him to get ahead of him in line, as he kept a constant eye on Daryl as he came into the shop. According to Daryl, this man looked pretty young, like in his early to mid-30s. He wore a green military jacket, and he had a deep voice. He asked him if he was a cop because of his car looking like a cop car. This is when Daryl said no, and he was quite taken aback with such a forward and sudden question. When it was the man's turn to order in line, he asked Eliza for a Coke. And instead of taking his seat, he walked around the counter and walked to the back of the store. Daryl, being former military policeman and owning a security company, he found this all to be really strange, and he had a weird feeling about all of this. At the time, there were 2 other young couples in the shop, and none of them seemed to know or recognize who this strange man was that went to the back of the store with his soda. When it was Daryl's turn in line to order, he asked Eliza, who was at the register, and she was talking to her mom, where did that man go, because he went to the back of the store. Eliza then told him that he needed to use the bathrooms, which happened to be located at the back of the store. She told Daryl that customers were usually not allowed to use the bathrooms, but she told this man that it was okay for him to use the bathrooms because he claims that he really needed to go. So Daryl, in the meantime, again, is sitting with this very strange feeling, and he just found it all really odd. And so he waited a bit to see if this man would leave the bathroom, but after waiting for some time, he decided to leave. This man was in the bathroom for quite a long time. Maria, Eliza's mother, left shortly after Daryl did, not knowing that this was the last time she would be seeing her daughter. After Maria left, Eliza's stepfather, James, and her stepmother had stopped by the shop to say hello and to just check in on the girls. They were there for about 20 minutes, and then they left, telling the girls that they would just see them later at night at the house. An older couple then came into the yogurt shop, and they noticed 2 young men sitting together in a booth. This booth was located near the register. They later report that one of the men had lighter hair and one is in his late 20s, early 30s, and he was 5'6". The other man was bigger. They both wore oversized hooded coats, and their hoods were up, and they kept their heads down noticeably for what seemed like the whole time. Similar to the man who left to the bathroom earlier, the man who ordered the soda, these 2 men in the booth seemed agitated and were acting very strangely. It was noted that these men sitting in the booth seemed to be listening closely to Eliza and Jennifer's conversation, because as they were sitting there, they didn't seem to be talking. They seemed to be sitting in silence. The older couple felt uneasy, and they left shortly around 10:45 p.m. And so it's getting pretty late. So around 11 p.m., Eliza was following closing protocol by locking the doors from the inside, and she flipped the open sign to close. Eliza was known for being meticulous about strictly following closing protocol for the shop. And Sarah and Amy were helping out in the back of the shop while Jennifer continued to clean. The shop policy was to lock the doors from the inside first, so no new customers can come in after 11 p.m., but current customers can stay inside until they're done. At this time, the only customers left in the yogurt shop were the 2 men sitting together in the booth near the register. Around this same time, the no sale button was pushed on the register, which means that the cash register was opened, but no sale had taken place. Sometime between then and midnight, all 4 girls were forced into the storage area in the back of the shop. They were stripped of their clothes, completely naked. Sarah's hands were tied together behind her back with a pair of underwear belonging to one of the other girls. She was gagged with an item of clothing, and then she was raped. Eliza also had her hands tied together behind her back, and she was gagged. Amy had a cloth tied around her neck, and she was strangled and raped. The girls were then forced on their knees and shot in the back of their heads, execution style. Their bodies were stacked up on top of each other in the storage room. Amy was shot twice. The first shot had missed her brain, and so she was shot at again, but this time with a .38 caliber gun. The other shots were actually from a .22 caliber. Since there were two different types of guns used, this implies that there were at least two killers involved. $540 was stolen from the register, but there was a bank bag underneath the register that had more money inside but was not taken. The killers then poured lighter fluid into styrofoam cups, lit them on fire, and tossed them into the back room where the girls' bodies were, assuming the fire would destroy the evidence. Then they ran out the back entrance into the alleyway. The key to the front door of the shop was never removed, meaning the last customers were the ones who murdered the girls. Around midnight, an officer named Troy Guy was on patrol near the shopping center, and he noticed smoke from around the shops there. So he headed that way, and that is when he first saw the next door party shop owner, Jorge Barney, waving his arms frantically. The windows of the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt shop was blacked out with thick smoke. It was at this point that Troy Guy called the fire department, and within minutes, over 50 firefighters showed up to the scene. Firefighters frantically rushed to put out the flames using high-powered fire hoses that used hundreds of gallons of water. And none of them would have guessed that they just arrived to a horribly gruesome crime scene. No effort was made to preserve evidence because they did not know this was more than just the standard kitchen or electrical fire. When one sees fire in a business establishment that serves food, one usually assumes that something must have went off in the kitchen, and so the goal of the firefighters, of course, is to contain and put out the fire. Once inside, one of the firefighters went to the back of the shop to check out the storage area, and that's when the first thing he saw was a foot sticking out of the doorway. It was from this that he discovered the bodies of 17-year-old Eliza Thomas, 17-year-old Jennifer Harbison, and 15-year-old Sarah Harbison. Their bodies were burned and were barely recognizable. Within a few minutes, they found 13-year-old Amy Ayer's body near the bathrooms, a couple of feet away. Amy had severe burns to over 30% of her body. Years later, one of the firefighters said in an interview that it was so dark inside the yogurt shop that they couldn't see anything. So by the time they first saw the foot, he said, "I feel like we had already stepped on some of the bodies." There is DNA evidence left behind from the two girls that we know were raped. There were also 5 hairs found on the girls' bodies. But with the large volumes of water from the high-pressure hoses, the crime scene was compromised. At this time, Austin did not have its own forensic unit. The Austin Police Department was pretty small. But the Texas Department of Public Safety did have a new CSI lab and one trained technician who was new and inexperienced. Also, since it was the early 90s, DNA testing was still in its early infancy. The one trained technician, whose name was Irma Rios, later admitted prior to the yogurt shop murders she had only processed one other arson homicide case. Detective John Jones was the first police officer to arrive at the crime scene. The scene was not locked down, and many ways to collect potential evidence were ignored. Fingerprints were not taken from the bathrooms, even though they swiped for fingerprints on the cash register, which was likely based on the assumption that this was a robbery. However, there was that man who was acting strangely and erratically, the one who ordered the soda, and he had gone to the bathroom. So his DNA could have been in the bathroom, and they could have swiped for that. There were full trash bags from the day at the scene, and officers did not look through the trash for any potential evidence, such as any receipts or that soda can that the man had ordered. Some items from the crime scene would later go missing, with no one being able to indicate where they went. For instance, there was a metal shelving unit and a charred mop and mop bucket that had crime scene tape wrapped around it, and these things were placed in the back alley, but then they suddenly disappeared. Rios, the technician from the CSI lab, could never explain what happened to these vanished items. Also, the lock to the back door, which the suspects ran through, was removed by Austin Police Department, but it was never seen again. Overall, it took almost 4 hours for the Department of Public Safety crime scene investigators to arrive. And so, before they arrived, for those 4 hours, the crime scene was not locked down, meaning that the crime scene was being trampled on by police officers, firefighters, arson investigators, and paramedics. So to say the least, the processing of the crime scene was not handled well at all. This case was incredibly disturbing and horrifying, and the city of Austin was sad for the victims' families. The day after the murders, people across town went to place flowers, bears, and candles in front of the yogurt shop to create a makeshift shrine in memory of the girls. White ribbons were seen everywhere in memory of their innocence. The students from Lanier High School, where the girls went, were of course upset upon losing their fellow classmates. On December 10th, 4 days after the murders, a memorial service was held for the girls, and over 1,500 people attended. There were billboards placed around town with the faces of the 4 smiling teenage girls, with the 4 words, "Who killed these girls?" As mentioned before, violent crime was not common in Austin. The community was absolutely shaken, and the fear was understandably rampant. Gun sales in Austin increased 15%, and security companies and shooting ranges reported increased business. And parents who used to let their children go out at night now thought twice. It is said that Austin was forever changed after these murders. As mentioned before, the Austin Police Department was pretty small at the time. And even though nothing could have been done with the already and unknowingly compromised crime scene upon putting out the fire, even after finding the bodies, many officers involved in the investigation had no training or prior experience processing this type of crime scene. Investigators were connected to Darryl Croft, the former military policeman mentioned at the beginning of this video, who entered the shop. Darryl was the one who had the strange encounter with the man who bought the soda. And they also interviewed the older couple who came in after Darryl. These 3 witnesses continued to describe the 3 strange men who acted oddly. On December 12, 1991, 2 days after the memorial service, The autopsy files were sealed by a judge in order to keep certain details about the case secret so that only detectives knew about them. At the time, autopsies in Travis County were, by law, public record. But in this case, the Austin Police Department believed that having the autopsies public would hurt the investigation. So they only released redacted versions to be made public. On December 14th, 16-year-old Maurice Pierce was brought in for police questioning. He was picked up a few blocks away from the yogurt shop for having a .22 caliber handgun tucked into his pants. Maurice Pierce was questioned by Detective Hector Polanco from the Austin Police Department. Polanco was considered a top-notch detective at the time, and he was known for having a convict-at-all-costs approach. Polanco specifically asked Maurice about the recent murders at the yogurt shop that happened just the week before. Maurice claimed he loaned his gun to his friend, 15-year-old Forrest Wellborn, and that it was Forrest who murdered the girls in the yogurt shop. Forrest was then questioned but denied any involvement in the yogurt shop murders. He told police he was with Maurice and two other boys, 16-year-old Robert Burns Springsteen Jr. and 17-year-old Michael James Scott. He claimed that the four of them, at that time of the murders, were on a trip to San Antonio in a stolen SUV. Forrest was given a polygraph test and he passed. So none of the crime scene evidence could be connected to any of the four boys, and so they were then dismissed for now. Over 50 false confessions have been made in this case, and if we were to break down each one, then we'll be here forever. So there weren't nearly enough resources to look into each one. Again, the Austin Police Department was pretty small, and so some of these weren't even investigated. Over 340 suspects were looked into, and one of these false confessions was from a teenage girl and her boyfriend, which was completely disproven and tossed out. The phenomenon of false confessions is fascinating and sad. Whether it's falsely claiming responsibility for the crime in order to have some sort of fame, since this was a pretty high-profile case, or pressure from interrogations. Detective Hector Polanco was suspected of coercion of some of these false confessions, and so he was removed from the case on March 23, 1992. As mentioned earlier in the video, around this time in the early 90s, it was when satanic panic was in full swing, which means many goth kids dressed in black and listened to a lot of metal were rounded up and questioned even more so than the average Austin citizen. This all ultimately led to nothing. Tips continued to come into the Austin Police Department, but the case went cold. In 1996, Detective Paul Johnson took over this case. He went through all the case files again, and he started testing evidence. In early 1999, the bullets from the murders were tested on the .22 caliber handgun confiscated from Maurice Pierce. Ballistics showed they were not a match. Police suspected Maurice of having some kind of mental illness, and Detective Johnson was not convinced with this ballistics result, and he was determined to prove Maurice and his friends were somehow involved in the yogurt shop murders. He still considered them a promising lead despite no evidence tying them to the case. On September 9, 1999, Michael Scott was brought in for questioning, and he was interrogated for 5 days. After over 20 hours of interrogations, he confessed to the murders and claimed that Maurice made him shoot one of the girls in the head. You can find clips of these interrogations with Michael online, and I will have to say they are difficult to watch. During an interrogation, at some point, a detective is seen putting a gun to Michael's head. And that sure is a way to force a confession when someone is not only afraid but also exhausted. On September 15th, Robert Springsteen was picked up in Charleston, West Virginia. He was interrogated for over 5 hours. In some parts of the recorded interrogation, detectives are seen yelling in Robert's face. After many hours of interrogation, Robert confessed to involvement in the murders and raping 13-year-old Amy Ayers. The details he provided were either mixed up, such as which gun was used to shoot Amy first, and other details just didn't fit the case at all. Police theorized the original plan was for the three boys to just rob the yogurt shop while one stayed in the getaway car. But then something went wrong and they ended up murdering the girls. Detective Johnson did not consult with Detective Polanco, who was the first one to interrogate the boys back in 1991. But remember, Polanco was taken off the case with involvement of coercion of false confessions with this case. So who knows if that would have helped. On October 6, 1999, police arrested Maurice Pierce in Louisville, Texas, and Robert Springsteen in Charleston, West Virginia. They also arrested Michael Scott in Austin and Forrest Wellborn in Lockhart, Texas. Blood and hair samples were taken from these four men, and by the end of 1999, Robert, Michael, and Maurice were indicted for these crimes. 2 grand juries failed to indict Forrest, and so the charges were dropped against him. Michael and Robert recanted their confessions and claimed that they were manipulated into confessing by Detective Johnson. The trial of Robert Springsteen began early 2001, 10 years after the murders, and he was charged specifically with Amy's murder. The prosecution was seeking the death penalty. Portions of Robert's interrogation were shown to the jury during his trial. Dr. Richard Offshee, a social psychology professor, testified about the illegal tactics used by the police that resulted in false confessions. But he was blocked from giving his opinion on whether or not the tape that was shown actually showed that Robert was coerced while in court. However, outside of the trial and with the media, Dr. Offshee made it clear that the tactics used during Robert's interrogation were the same tactics used that have led to false confessions. The defense was only allowed to mention 2 out of the 50 false confessions made over the years, and they were not allowed to mention the possibility of serial killer Kenneth MacDuff potentially committing these murders. It seems like mentioning 50 false confessions would be important to mention in court, because that is a lot of false confessions. So more info on Kenneth MacDuff. Kenneth MacDuff was an American serial killer who raped and murdered teenage girls in the 1960s, and he operated across several counties in Texas. MacDuff was initially arrested and sentenced to life in prison for these rapes and murders. However, MacDuff ended up being one of 127 convicted murderers who were paroled in 1989 because of prison overcrowding. Within 3 days of his release, he began killing women and teenage girls all over again. A map was found inside MacDuff's car, and it had directions to within 3 blocks of the yogurt shop. On December 29, 1991, 23 days after the murders, MacDuff had kidnapped 28-year-old Colleen Reed from Austin Car Wash. Him and an accomplice murdered Colleen soon after. On May 4, 1992, he was finally arrested again and was sentenced to death. Despite the timing and the map found in his car, MacDuff was ruled out by investigators. And before his execution in 1998, MacDuff told them that if he had murdered the girls, he would admit to it, like how he admitted to all of his other murders. He was the type of killer who was proud of his victim count and reportedly bragged openly about his crimes. So, I guess at least he's honest. So back to Robert's trial, the prosecution was allowed to submit Michael Scott's confession as evidence for Robert's trial. Jurors were shown graphic pictures of the crime scene over and over again, which, of course, was traumatizing. Robert was ultimately found guilty and sentenced to death. Michael Scott's trial took place in 2002, which transpired very similarly to Robert's. Robert's confession was then used as evidence in Michael's trial, and Michael was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. It is worth noting that Daryl Croft and the older couple that were in the yogurt shop that night were not called to be witnesses in either Michael or Robert's trials, which, given they were some of the last witnesses to see the girls alive on the night of the murders, it's a little ridiculous. Evidence presented in both trials primarily relied on the confessions made after hours of interrogation. Maurice Pierce never even went to trial. Charges against him were dropped in 2003 due to lack of evidence, and he had been in prison for more than 3 years. Robert and Michael appealed their verdicts. On May 25, 2006, Robert's conviction was overturned since Michael's confession had been used as evidence by the prosecution. On June 2007, Michael's conviction was overturned since Robert's confession was used against him. So for years, analysts tried to extract a DNA profile from the sample taken from Amy Ayer's body. There have been such progress made in the field of DNA testing over the decades. And again, in the early 90s, DNA testing was still in its infancy. So in March 2008, it was revealed that the analysts were able to extract a new kind of DNA strand called YSTR, also known as the Y strand. This strand is found in males only and is shared by fathers, sons, and uncles. This DNA strand did not match any of the previously charged men, Maurice, Michael, Forrest, or Robert, nor any of the males in their families either. Investigators did not rule out the possibility that there may have been a fifth accomplice that the DNA belonged to. On June 2009, defense attorneys revealed that the same DNA profile was found on one of the other girls. Prosecutors then went on to test more than 100 men, which resulted in nothing. They tested all acquaintances of the 4 previously charged men, employees at the medical examiner's office just in case of contamination, everyone who had stepped foot in the crime scene before it got locked down, as well as any customers who they could identify being in the yogurt shop on the day of the murders. Yearbooks were even used from the girls' schools to try to find potential classmates that could have been involved, and they would then conduct covert operations to try to acquire these DNA samples to test for. Many of you who are into true crime may recall this sort of covert operations being used, such as, being under surveillance and waiting for some kind of trash to be thrown away. As you can tell, the investigation was time-consuming and very expensive, but at this point, the prosecutors were determined to find the source of this Y-strand DNA. A retrial of Michael Scott was scheduled for July 2009, but in June, DA Rosemary Lemberg announced there will be no retrial until the unknown male suspect of the Y-strand DNA was identified. Michael and Robert were released from prison, and in 2011, the lead defense attorney for Michael Scott, Carlos Garcia, was re-examining the case files when he noticed something. In a picture of the inside of the yogurt shop, all the chairs were stacked on tables and booths, as the cleanup process usually goes when a restaurant's being cleaned and closed for the night. All chairs were stacked on these tables, except, notably, for one booth, the one nearest to the cash register. This is the booth where the 2 suspicious men, the last customers, were sitting at. This only backs up eyewitness statements that these were the last customers who stayed at the booth until closing. Close to around this time in December 2010, Maurice Pierce was in an altercation with Austin Police Department during a traffic stop. He stabbed the officer and ended up getting shot dead. In 2017, investigators entered the Y-strand DNA profile from Amy Ayers into a database for the YSTR strands. This database was run by the University of Central Florida's National Center for Forensic Science, and there was a match. Travis County Prosecutor Efrain de la Fuente called the families of the murdered girls to tell them about this break in the case. On March 9, 2017, investigators sent a grand jury subpoena to the University of Central Florida in order to find where this match in DNA came from. They learned that a forensic analyst from the FBI actually submitted the matching DNA. So the FBI was the one who came back with the matching DNA. Austin Police Department were hopeful, since it's the FBI, that they assumed that they would help them out with this case and this match. However, things did not go as planned. The FBI said that the DNA was submitted for testing purposes only in order to help scientists learn more about Y strands, and they claim none of the samples submitted could be matched to an individual. While it's true thousands of men could be traced to this Y strand, there have been successes in solving cases using familial DNA, such as, famously, the Golden State Killer. The FBI then pointed to a 1994 federal law that created a National Forensics Database. The law dictated that the database would be used by law enforcement to investigate cases with the requirement that the identity of the anonymous donors would be kept confidential and not released to other law enforcement agencies. Austin Police Department believed that it was legal for the FBI to share this DNA information and argued that the source could possibly be revealed. However, the FBI stood their ground and refused on the basis that this match could be linked to thousands of men. And so this back and forth continued for 3 years, which brings us to 2020. On February 4th, 2020, Congressman Michael McCall, who represents the Texas 10th District, including Austin, sent a letter to the FBI, urging them to release the DNA source. Travis County prosecutors are considering using a subpoena to access the DNA source. However, this will be a long process. So here we are today, in 2021. This December will mark 30 years since the horrific murders at the yogurt shop. What was once the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt Shop is now a nail salon, where a memorial plaque is placed near a tree in front of the shop for the girls in their memory. Hopefully someday there will be answers and justice will be served for the girls and their families. And I'm curious to know, what are your thoughts and theories on this case? Let me know in the comments if there are any other cases or urban legends, spooky things in general, that you are interested for me to look into and talk about. And please hit the like it button and subscribe. So thanks for listening, y'all. It was a long case to talk about. It is a lot to talk about. And it's still wild to me that 30 years later, we still don't know who did this. And as you can tell, I ran out of cleaning my plants, so next time I'll make sure to have more plants to clean and whatnot. Thanks for listening, y'all. Take care of yourselves and each other.